Alors j'ai le grand honneur et grand plaisir euh, d'introduire Michael Harbsmeir, qui est professeur émérite à l'Université de Roskilde au Danemark. Il est anthropologue, spécialisé dans l'histoire globale des récits de voyage, expert du concept de Travels from Elsewhere, et sa bibliographie me demande d'être polyglotte, puisque ses titres, tous très marquants, sont dans différentes langues. Donc je citerai par exemple Travels from the Orient, Travels to the Orient, Does Comparison Make Sense? Ou alors Heimkehrrituale, Prolegomena zu einer Weltgeschichte des Reiseberichts als globale literarische Gattung, Allocentrism and Alterities, Ultra Short History of the Gen of the Travelogue. Je continue, j'essaye en tout cas. Autoethnographic Cosmopolity, Jewish Travel Writers, mentor coelogenists. Interrogating travelers on the production of Western knowledge in early modern Japan. Inverted Explorations, Inuit Experiences of Denmark. Le monde renversé, quelques expériences chinoises de la modernité européenne au XIXe siècle. Fremde Blicke, aus Ansichten Europas im 17. Jahrhundert et Early Travels to Europe, Some Remarks on the Magic of Writing. Et c'est un grand honneur de vous écouter maintenant sur Europe in the Eyes of its Authors.
Merci pour cette grande et généreuse présentation. Et apologies for speaking not in French, and what's even worse, for speaking about a whole lot of texts in other languages I do not speak, travel accounts which I only know from translations, and even worse, based largely on secondary sources. So this is not yet another substantial studies of which we have had so many brilliant examples today, but I will offer rather a dessert with reflections which take us to the end of the 19th century and which will bring us back to the beginning of it all, the three traditions of travel writing which Ottmar was talking about to begin with. So I hope this will do to keep you awake for yet another. I hope it won't be too long. When I began to look out for what I then thought of as a kind of lettre persane from the hands of authentically Oriental travelers in 1984, which I presented at a conference where both Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak and Homi Baba were present. I did this on the basis of an idea about writing being the central issue for those who went to places where they were impressed by representations of another things, among others, themselves. And this is sort of the idea which I then have been following through on the basis of all the texts which have come out after 1984, both translations and collections showing the breadth of sources you could make use of, many of which these are, okay, I just show you the titles. You probably can't see much. But these two, for example, we have heard more about the two of them, the one of them at least, from earlier periods. But I'm going further on to the from the Arab world. We have heard much about already of Al-Takhtawi and others, so I don't want to repeat myself here. I'll repeat what also already has been said more than once at this conference. Turning eastwards from the Arab to the Ottoman world, the pattern seems to repeat itself with a twist. Evliya Çelebi, already mentioned, also the most famous of the Ottoman travelers and the earliest ambassadors to Europe of the 18th century, were as deeply impressed by what they recognized as superior means and ways of communication and representation as their many successors of the 19th and early 20th century, traveling to the same destinations. Where the earlier generations merely described and admired the libraries, theaters, opera houses, printing presses, post offices, museums, exhibitions, monuments, panoramas, and other public displays. Later travelers were increasingly in search for improvement and progress to be introduced at home as well. Perhaps even more interestingly, however, Ottoman travelers of the 19th century also turned eastwards themselves, thereby producing their own variety of Orientalism. Orientalism a la Turca was the title of one of the articles from 20 years ago, which now has been followed up by a substantial dissertation on Ottoman travelers' perceptions of the East, late Ottoman Empire, and which also can be seen as an invitation to compare travels to the Orient with travels from the Orient by focusing on the Occidentalist as against the Orientalist Ottoman travel accounts of the 19th and early 20th century. Turning a further step eastwards to the Indo-Persian and Persian traditions of travel writing, we finally come to yet another and even better reason for answering the question whether it makes sense to compare with other traditions of travel writing. Sanjay already has been mentioned. Sanjay, these are the ones which I jumped over. But Sanjay Subramaniam and Mustafa Alam were first to point out that many of the Indo-Persian travel accounts of the Age of Discovery had very little or nothing to do with any European presence or inspiration. Europeans were a very marginal figure in much of the early modern literature worldwide. The few and better known exceptions, Sheikh Itimassuddin's report of his visit to France and Britain, already mentioned, the Wonders of Vilayet being one of the titles, and Mirza Abul Kaletan's travels in Asia, Africa, and Europe during that, from the late 18th century, thus appear as, in a new light as links of a chain ranging from the Mughal to the Safavid and the travelers of Qajar Empire of the 19th century. And it is precisely in this field that the comparative study of travel accounts has taken the most spectacular steps forward through the last couple of decades. The most recent of the monographs about Persian travel accounts from the Qajar period and previous periods, Hamid Dabashi's Reversing the Colonial Gaze, Persian Travelers Abroad, spends quite a lot of energy on many other destinations, from Kamram Rastegar's wide-ranging studies, the literary modernity between the Middle East and Europe from 2007, Nagmes Sorabi's Taken for Wonder, 19th century travel accounts from Iran to Europe, and the anthology on the wonders of land and sea, Persian travel writing from 2013, and further dissertations and a lot of articles have devoted most of their comparative attention to the European experiences of these generations of travelers. And the best illustration how far a micro-historical study of just one of these Iranian voyages to Europe can take us in the direction of a better understanding of emphatically global interactions can be found in Niall Green's admirably detailed reconstruction of what 6 Iranian students learned during their stay in England from 1815 to 1819 on the basis of Mirza Ali Shirazi's travel account, who was the Tahtavi of these students, if you want. From a certainly excessively broad comparative point of view, nearly all these travel accounts of Muslim origin, which I've mentioned so far, of voyages to Europe, seem to share two what I provocatively will call obsessions when it comes to describing the European experiences. First of all, gender relations are a main concern of almost all these observers entering heterosocial space, public spaces open for both men and women, and the general visibility of unveiled women led particularly many Persian voyagers to project their erotic fantasies on Farangi women, ranging from extended narratives of erotic adventures to warning about the dangers of seduction, etc., something which also can be found in Al-Tahtawi already. And as particular Mohammed Tawakkali Orgi has argued, and Afsani Najmabadi has further developed, descriptions of the otherness of European gender relations have played a critical role in defining and redefining gender roles in Iran through the 19th century. Travel accounts to Europe playing a crucial role in that respect. Secondly, as already noticed a couple of times, all kinds of technologies, and more particularly technologies of representation of communication, played a similarly crucial role in almost all these accounts. Visiting endless numbers of museums, libraries, theaters, zoos and botanical gardens, panoramas, dioramas, Madame Tussauds, printing presses, bookshops, newspaper, post office, photographers, prisons, hospitals, factories, military barracks and parades have been an overwhelming experience for many of the travelers who often had ambiguous feelings about being offered to recognize themselves in all the images and representations they were offered as if exhibited themselves. Awe and wonder about superior technologies of representation, or what they problematized as being superior, often went hand in hand with critical curiosity and the attempt to bring home some of these technologies and inventions, such as, for example, and prominently, the printing presses to be used for journals and newspapers, and even for producing the very travel accounts in print, their own very travel accounts. Seen from a yet even wider, to be even more provocative, comparative perspectives, these two major themes seem to dominate not only the accounts from the Muslim world, but also come out among visitors from other continents, such, for example, Africa, as I've tried to show in another article about Schauspiel Europa, Spectacle Europe. And let us look now at another series, what difference it makes in the world, which tradition our travelers come from. Coming to China, there also is a whole series of recent publications shedding new light on the experiences and writings of the diplomats, students and exiled politicians who went to Europe, Japan and other parts of the world during the last decades of the 19th century. Until not so long ago, one had to rely only on a handful of translations and texts to get a picture of how the visitors from the Middle Kingdom tried to come to terms with the experience of what many of them summarized as the world turned upside down, the very exactly opposite of their own, being informed by better knowledge of the history of Chinese travel writing through the centuries. Two recent studies in particular have advanced a deeper understanding of the roots of what paradoxically turned out as a kind of Sinocentric Occidentalism, going back with Xiaofo Tian, to the early medieval periods, and with Wang Mingming all the way to King Mu's mysterious journey to the west from around the year 1000 BC. Lots of references to the tradition of Chinese travel writing in particular. And with Jenny Huangfu Day's wonderful book, King Travelers to the Far West, Diplomacy and the Information Order in Late Imperial China from 2018, we finally get further steps away from viewing the Chinese travelers to the West as one-dimensional monitors of European otherness towards a more complex and nuanced understanding of the individual diplomatic intellectuals and their different ways of handling similarities between China and the Western countries they visited in the light of their own understanding of Chinese history, all of them mobilizing various earlier Chinese experiences to familiarize their readers with the new observations as if they were already there from the beginning. Portraying Zhang Dei as the most prolific traveler among the diplomats and as a collector of curiosities, preferring to submerge the reader in a magical carnival with an endless array of strange events and objects. Jenny Hangfu Day also has paved the way for studying the probably most important two Chinese travelers from the late 19th and early 20th century, who both spent many years in exile in many different countries, among them European countries, and wrote and published extensively about their observation and experiences. The first of these, Wang Tao, has now been made more accessible for the English-speaking world and for me through the dissertation from Edinburgh University, a study of Wang Tao's travelogues with reference to late King Chinese foreign travels, also with the reproduction of some of the most important texts, the translation. Being more famous as a most influential translator, reformer, and political columnist, newspaper publisher, and fiction writer of the Qing dynasty, Wang Tao's record of travels in Japan and his jotting from careful travel from 1890 and other novels and travelogues are brilliant examples of how Chinese observers managed to mobilize the deep Chinese past as a reservoir of inspiration to make sense of their contemporary experiences. Seeing the women he encounters on his travels in exile in the light of the mysterious kingdom of women at the end of King Mu's very famous mysterious voyage to the far west, Tao represents Europe as both a site of gender inversion and the reversal of normative gender roles, as well as a real and imaginary male sexual and erotic adventure. These are Kang Yu-wei, on the other hand, whose fame and importance as politician, reformer, and intellectual surpasses that of Wang Tao, has relatively, and I don't have the time to present further detail, has relatively little to say about gender relations and women on his many different accounts of his travels in exile to more than 31 different European countries and to Japan and the New World and so on and so forth. While still waiting for a more systematic survey of all his travel writings, one can see from already published and translated texts that Kang Yu-wei on his way constantly compares one country to the next. It's funny to see that the part on Switzerland has been translated into German. The one from Norway is found in Norwegian. The part covering Denmark is and every time the one country is even better than the one you came from. So this is sort of running through the world as a prophet of a kind of universal Chinese advancement, if they only were listening to what he had to say. Going from, yes. He is constantly looking for the institutions, technologies, and arrangements which are the most advanced and progressive in one country as against the less advanced and more backwards in the other from where he just arrived. And so as we only can learn from very recent and still ongoing studies and translations, Kang Yu-wei also had a lot to say about Serbia, Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire, developments in Mexico, all this in the light of the imperial Chinese standards to which Kang Yu-wei also devoted a well-known, unique utopian vision, his Ta Tung Shu, the one-world philosophy about the complete abolition of all differentiations and distinctions between human beings, including those between men and women. It's a very, very radical summary of his travel experience, as if he went finally to the one destination, which is all about making China the model for the rest of the world. To judge from has been so far about the Chinese experiences of the West, they seem to have much in common with the previously described obsessions, if you will allow me this expression once more, with technologies of communication and the relationship between men and women. On closer inspection, however, there are some differences. Concerning gender relations, Chinese observers always had as much to say about differences in the relationships between the generations as between men and women. Chinese observers such as Wang Tao surely shared imaginations of sexual and erotic adventures with Western women, but with them they appear to imply the inversion and the reversal of normative gender and generational roles, a world turned upside down, in other words. When it comes to discussions of technologies and institutions of representation and communication, there also seems to obtain a subtle difference. Chinese observers such as Kang Yu-wei had no trouble with identifying and also adopting all sorts of technologies and inventions as long as they were able to make them appear as of Chinese and therefore universal origin. Adding at this stage of my comparative ramblings the case of early modern Japanese experience with Europe, a summary of the relevant sources and comparative few recent studies, will have little to add to what we have said already about China. Japanese observations of the Dutch at Deshima, of the tradition of Dutch studies of Rangaku in Japan, had as little to say about gender and generations as can be found in the interrogations of shipwrecked Japanese and European guests and prisoners, which functioned as a kind of substitute for proper travel accounts during the period where no Japanese were allowed to leave the country. It was thus only with the first envoys, ambassadors and students at the very end of the Tokugawa period that Japanese visitors and travelers did confront Western women at parties and receptions to let them comment on their astonishment and embarrassment about being placed side by side with women on both sides of the table and even to be invited to dance with them afterwards. There are very many poems sort of describing this kind of challenge they were confronted with. To judge on the basis of the secondary sources and translations I have been able to consult, these confrontations only rarely led to any imaginary erotic or sexual fantasies for the Japanese observers or travelers. Admiration for and the will to copy, imitate, and bring home technologies and institutions previously only known from Hörensagen certainly was a central issue also in the diary of travel account preceding the monumental reports of the Iwakura mission. Sorry for being late with this. For the Iwakura mission from 1870 to 1873, which we consider as the ultimate account, the apotheosis of an expedition from elsewhere to Europe and the West in a spirit of social Darwinism and global progress and competition. Starting from North Africa at the one end and having come to Japan now at the other, it is time perhaps to see whether we forgot anything on our way. And indeed there actually is a whole series of non-Muslim, of Parsi and Hindu, Indian travelers to first of all England and the capital of the British Empire, who have substantial accounts of their experiences in the form of travel accounts and diaries written mainly in English and published mainly in India. And therefore also there is a quite substantial number of recent critical studies of these travel accounts, such as Inderpal Gruel's Home and Harem, Nation, Gender, Empire and the Cultures of Travel, Antoinette Burton's At the Heart of Empire, Indians and the Colonial Encounter in Late Victorian Britain, or Simon Thyssen Travels to Europe, Self and Other in Bengali Travel Narratives 1870 to 1910. And Julie F. Codell's article Reversing the Grand Tour, Guest Discourse in Indian Travel Narratives from 2007, and most recently Pramod Nayar's Indian Travel Writing at the Age of Empire from 2020. So there's a lot to read about yet another tradition. Compared to all the other cases considered so far, both of these studies and the travel literature they analyze and try to understand have a number of features in common. They all take the colonial context as point of departure, and they all look for models and inspiration, not in older, venerable traditions of travel writing or in history and prehistory of their own, but in 19th century British romantic and European romantic travel writing. And almost all of them have a strong focus on gender relations as something which is discussed as a relationship, being the things are different in one place rather than in the other. And finally, there are also many female authors among both the authors of the travel accounts as among those who study them. Due to these peculiarities, these Indian and Bengali accounts of travels to Britain and Europe are strikingly different from all others we have been discussing so far. Perhaps they are the ones who, rather than coming to Europe from elsewhere, instead have managed to come home from Europe as colonial subject, males as well as females. They are sort of the inverted Marco Polo, if we follow your presentation, being strikingly different from the Chinese, Japanese, as well as Muslim experience. With respect to the two themes we recognized as being crucial for the previously mentioned traditions of travel writing, one could perhaps go so far as to say that gender relations for the Indian travelers perhaps did function as a metaphor for the relationship between colonial master and colonial subject, but never served as defining otherness in the way of the Muslim or Japanese travelers. And the apparently superior technologies and institutions similarly appear in the light of the relativization of progress and rationality characteristic of contemporary European romantic travel writing. So there's here another difference. There's no doubt that many of the Arab, Ottoman, Persian, Indo-Persian, Chinese and Japanese accounts of travels to Europe and the West also could be analyzed from a similarly post-colonial perspective as more or less sophisticated and successful attempts at turning the European romantic tradition, the European travel writing tradition of travel into gendered proto-nationalist weapons against colonial rule and oppression as expressions of what we call subaltern or vernacular cosmopolitanism. It remains to be seen, however, how fast the exceptionally growing number of such post-colonial readings of travelers from elsewhere will be able to replace any memories of those other traditions of travel writing which I've been talking about. Merci beaucoup.